Hi, this is Jamey with Stonemeyer Games, and I'm here today to talk about my favorite game mechanism in Pillars of the Earth, a worker placement game about building a cathedral in medieval Europe. My mechanism that I'm going to highlight today isn't exactly so much of a mechanism, but a general idea in games that Pillars of the Earth does really well. It's more of a graphic design element. In Pillars of the Earth, you start out with a certain number of coins, depending on your player position. So you randomize the first player tokens, and the player who goes first starts with 20 coins. Then the next player 21, then 22, then 23. And what's important here is these little red flags, which the artist or graphic designer decided to put onto this track so that you don't have to refer to the rulebook to remember how many coins you start with, which I think is brilliant. They could have just left those flags off the track, and every time you play, you have to refer to the rulebook, or if you play a lot, then you probably end up remembering how many you start out with. But I really love it in games when the components themselves tell you what you need to start the game, so that you don't really have to refer to the rulebook at all. Because I think every time you refer to the rulebook in a game, it takes you a little bit out of the experience. You're stepping outside of the magic circle of the game, and you're looking at a rule book. So I like it when games include that on components. I was thinking about whether or not my own games do this. Euphoria does not do it particularly well because on the knowledge and morale tracks, I could have put a little indicator to show where your tokens start, and I didn't, and I should have. Viticulture Tuscany does it much better because all of your starting resources are on your Mama and Papa cards. You draw them at the beginning of the game randomly, you match them up, and you look at your starting resources. Scythe also does this really well. At the beginning of the game, you get a player mat and a faction mat, and all of your starting resources are noted on those mats. They're different depending on the mat that you have. And this made me kind of think, the subject came up because I recently saw a review for another game where you have to remove a certain number of cards from the deck at the beginning of the game. And not just a number of cards, but a number, of each different type of card, you have to remove a certain number of it. And so the game is pretty much saying, every time you play this game, you are going to have to look at the rule book to figure out how to do the setup. So right from the start of the game, it's taking you out of that magic circle of escaping into the world of a game. And I know why games do this. They do it so so the math is right, essentially, and so that the experience of playing a two-player game is mathematically the same as playing a four-player game. And sometimes this is important because it helps you avoid certain situations where, like in a two-player game, where you need to have access to a certain type of card, and if you dilute the deck too much, you may never see that card, which is fine. But in my opinion, I think we need to be more okay with, and we as designers, I think, need to be more okay with games that feel different and play different for different player counts. Meaning the math doesn't matter nearly as much as the overall experience of the game, and it's okay if that experience is different. I don't expect a two-player game to feel the same as a five-player game. I'll use Scythe as another example. In Scythe for the game board, I could have had a different game board for every player count. So mathematically, there's exactly the same number of hexes for each player count. But Scythe, I'm trying to tell a story through Scythe. Scythe is a world, and that world doesn't change based on the number of factions that decide to invade this territory. The territory is the same no matter what. Thematically, it is the same. And so in a two-player game, it makes sense that if only two factions are converging upon this area, there's going to be less conflict unless they really seek out conflict with one another. Mechanically, this was important to me as well in designing Scythe because I wanted couples to be able to play Scythe without necessarily having to clash with one another if that's not what they're into. Where conversely in Scythe, in a 4 or 5 player game, thematically, if you have a bunch of different factions converging onto a patch of land, there's going to be a lot more conflict. There's going to be a tighter hold of different territories and resources. It makes sense thematically, and that's reflected in the game. I didn't have to scale the map for those different player counts. And so this is you can tell I'm a little passionate about this. I think as designers, we just need to be more okay with understanding that different player counts are going to feel different, and we don't have to math it out, and we don't have to do little things during setup so that the math is exactly perfect for every player count, unless it's absolutely necessary. Because just by doing that, by making players refer to the rulebook for every setup, every time they play, you're taking them out of that experience. You're delaying the magic circle, essentially. I'd love to hear what you think about this. Do you prefer in games when there's a very specific setup for every different player count, and you have to refer to the rulebook to figure that out and math it out? Or do you prefer games that do feel different from 2 to 4 players or 5 players or 6 players, whatever the player count is, and you don't math it out? You use the same exact components for every game, and because of that, it feels different. And I've already mentioned the pros, how I feel about that side of things. So I'd love to hear what you think, and maybe some examples of other games that you've played that do one or the other, and how you've enjoyed those experiences or not enjoyed them. Thanks. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this.